Talkline Network Radio, America's longest-running Jewish broadcast network, the voice of the Jewish community.
Welcome to the podcast. And now,
you're listening to Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast on the air since 1981.
And now your host.
And we are back. Our guest, and he's been on with us quite often over the years, Rabbi Yeruchim Silber. He is currently Director of New York Government Relations for Good Israel of America, and he's the son of the legendary Rabbi Meilech Silber. And Rabbi Yaakov Rosenberg is a scholar, author, and educator from Lakewood, New Jersey. He's written the book called Blazing the Trail, the story of Rabbi Meilech Silber and the impact of the Yeshiva Eastern Parkway upon the American Torah world. So thank you for joining us. Good vach.
Good vach. I just want to say, add my condolences to the Melman family. As you know, I know obviously Joshua Morty very well. It's very sad to hear the news that you just mentioned about the Mrs. Melman.
Yeah, very sad. And really, they do so much for Klal Yisrael, and I know them on different levels and different places, and very special people, and so sad to hear about her passing. May her memory be a blessing, and may they only know from no more tsar, no more of this sadness. I want to start with you, Rabbi Yeruchim Silber, because this book that came out is a fascinating book about the Yeshiva Eastern Parkway, which is where I went to high school. So I have a very special connection. And I was very pleased that also the book is dedicated to Rabbi Shlomo Prager of blessed memory, who was my Rebbe in 10th grade. And I knew Rabbis and Shlomis Prager as well. But sure, Rabbi Prager was a man who was very, very special. And was it my imagination? I know that Rabbi Chaim Berlin Yeshiva and Rabbi Hutner had a tremendous impact on Yeshiva Eastern Parkway as well, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it began really as a branch of Yeshiva Chaim Berlin. In fact, it was started by a group of lay leaders, Balabatim, in Crown Heights then, who asked Rav Hutner, who were close to Rabbi Hutner, and asked them to send him a manal. And he sent my father to be the manal. He was then 24 years old. He walked in and he got the job sight unseen on the recommendation of Rabbi Hutner. And throughout, Rabbi Hutner was his really guide and mentor throughout the time that the yeshiva was there. So absolutely.
Now, the yeshiva was on East 45th Street and Church Avenue. That's when I went there as well. But when I went there, the neighborhood was not that great. I guess at some point, was the neighborhood better? I assume so when they built it.
Well, the yeshiva was originally at 991 Eastern Parkway, where I started going. And, yeah, listen, the neighborhood was a growing neighborhood. And I think, at the time that the yeshiva was, where they preached a lot, was about 1964, 65. A large amount of the student body actually came from East Flatbush, so it at that time made sense because they were really serving the student population. They were primarily coming from East Flatbush and a little bit from Crown Heights. So that's why the building was built there. Obviously, nobody had a crystal ball to know what would happen to a neighborhood, but at that time it was actually a lot of people from Brownsville moving in, so it was really during the 60s, in the mid-60s, it was actually growing for a while, East Flatbush.
Well, but you write in the book, I should say that Rabbi Rosenberg writes in the book, that there was perhaps a possibility of buying a land or building yeshiva, I think on Coney Island Avenue in the heart of Flatbush, and Rav Hutner said, don't do it.
Rabbi Chaim Berlin ended up buying later. But that was only for the Mesivta and the Bismedrash, because the Mesivta and Bismedrash were not so dependent on being close to where the boys lived. It wouldn't make sense for elementary school boys who lived in Crown Heights and East Flatbush to travel out to Coney Island, so they had to have the yeshiva more local. But they knew at the time that East Flatbush was not going to last, was not going to be a long-term home for the yeshiva. So they had an opportunity to buy a building, and they thought, maybe keep the elementary school in East Flatbush and move the Mesivta Bismedrash department to Coney Island, because we're going to have to move it at some point anyway. And Rav Hutner went down with Meilech Silber to check out the building. And he told them that it wasn't suitable for Mesivta, which Meilech accepted because it really wasn't. And then, 2 years later, that same building was offered to Chaim Berlin. And Rabbi Fruchthandler Shlita told me the story that he went down with Rav Hutner. He came to him to offer. He told Rav Hutner he has an offer for a building and wanted to go check it out. And Rav Hutner went with him, and they checked out the building, and he was all excited because look, it's such a great building for our yeshiva. And Rav Hutner was really not excited, and he couldn't understand why. And finally told him, I'll tell you the truth, I was here 2 years ago, with the Meilech Silber, and I advised him not to buy it for his Mesivta. So I can't buy it now for my own yeshiva. And I told him, but that was for a Mesivta. We need a lot of classrooms. It was a very narrow building. We need a bismedger, so make a long bismedger. You don't need so many classrooms. It's not a problem. And he said, yeah, you're right, but how could I buy it if I told him not to? And he just didn't feel comfortable buying it. And I called Meilech and told him what happened. He said, no, I understand. He was good advice from Mesivta. It wasn't suitable. But go ahead and buy it for the Bismedrish, because for Chaim Berlin Bismedrish, it's a good location, and they ultimately bought it, and that's the Chaim Berlin in there.
And that's where Avenue M and Coney Island Avenue.
Yep.
Very interesting story. So tell us, because the book is a lot of great pictures and great stories in the book, but tell us about the impact of the Yeshiva Eastern Parkway upon the American Torah world, which is the base of the book.
I'll start now hand to Rabbi Rosenberg. It was at that time probably the first yeshiva that was, a traditional yeshiva, but the staff was almost all American born, or at least American trained. At that time, most yeshivas had European rebbeim, and many of them really couldn't relate to the boys. So that was really one of the uniqueness, that there was really a school where the staff were American born or trained or studied, and really had that unique ability to relate to the boys. Rabbi Rosenberg?
Yeah, that's definitely true. It was a generation that was, in changing. It was in flux. Orthodoxy at the time. You had a lot of people came from Europe after the war. You had second generations people who came to America. Like the first generation were mostly not Shemesh Shabbos and some, Teveras, Chaim Berlin in the early years of Mesiras Nefesh to make some sort of yeshiva. But now you had their children who were growing up in America from American from parents, and they weren't sure what they were really looking for going forward. And it was an opportunity to make a mark, and they really did, because Eastern Parkway raised the bar. The first generation couldn't really go that far because they wouldn't have gotten Talmidim. They had to make accommodations for what the situation was in America. And he was willing to take it further, and he was willing to bet that the boys will go for it. And yeah, he had his rebbeim were pretty mostly straight out of Chaim Berlin Yeshiva. They were young, they were American, and they were B'nai Torah. The yeshivas were either took in Talmidei Chachamim from Europe, or they were, people who were trained who knew Hebrew. There was some maskilim. It wasn't, he were young B'nai Torah who convinced, grew up in America, went to yeshiva. Some Tevedas, you had Rabbi Tomer was from Tevedas, Rabbi Poltman was from Tevedas. Majority of them were from Chaim Berlin. Young people who went to yeshiva in America and were convinced it's time to, we're gonna change America. And they had that attitude, and they were very maskil in that.
Now, it's interesting because how orthodoxy has changed, and even the yeshiva, the yeshiva of Eastern Park, when I went there, obviously the yeshiva doesn't exist anymore today. I think the Mesivta still goes on, and there were Reb Chaim Epstein, Zeichel Tzadik Levracha, passed away, about 2015.
Yep.
But yeshivas have changed because of the times. It's a different thing. In fact, when my father went to Yeshiva Chaim Berlin in East New York, they were begging to get kids in. They actually paid people to go. You didn't pay tuition; they paid you to go. It's a whole different thing today. So it's nice. It's interesting to see how orthodoxy has changed, and the yeshivas played a very important role in that.
But I would say Yeshiva Eastern Parkway was unique for that. How many boys came in from families who were not religious, not Orthodox, didn't pay a lot of tuition. The policy was that anybody wanted yeshiva was taken in, and there were hundreds of families who actually became Orthodox, became religious, because their children were in Yeshiva Eastern Parkway. There were many, many stories. That if you go through the book, there's numerous stories how kids came in from totally non-Orthodox homes, and they became transformed. And today, many of them are prominent people, Rosh Yeshivas, and very prominent people that are still around today in the Jewish world who did not come from religious backgrounds and were transformed by the Yeshiva Eastern Parkway.
Can you tell us some stories related? Go ahead. Tell us some stories related to that. Go ahead, Rabbi Rosenberg.
There's a number of them in the book. Those are by Germain, Rabbi Avner Germain, who would bring in. He was a very active Rav. He had a Talmud Torah, like every shulman at the time, which was after public school, 2 hours of Hebrew school, mostly just to get him bar mitzvah, and then that would be the end of it. But he was very dedicated, and if he worked on his boys to get him to go to real yeshivas. And if he had boys that he convinced them and their parents to go to yeshiva, then he sent them to Eastern Parkway. There was no tuition because they were coming from public school. They're doing the rabbi a favor and sending their kids to trying out yeshiva. Rabbi Silber took them all in. He took them in by everyone. I interviewed many alumni of the yeshiva, and they all told me, we had in our class a number of boys. Rabbi Germain's boys, I knew who they were. And Rabbi Germain would follow up. He was in yeshiva all the time. He would speak to the Rabbi and find out how the boys were doing and everything else, because nobody else was doing that. But he had that policy. It was a fascinating story. This I heard from Rabbi Brilovsky, who was the assistant principal in the later years. And this happened in the summer of 1970. The Yeshiva of Eastern Parkway also had a day camp for the children who stayed in the city, and they didn't want them to lose everything over the summer. This was also one of his original ideas. There were day camps, but a yeshiva having a day camp was a new idea that Rabbi Silber came up with. So at the time, Rabbi Lovsky was involved in running the day camp, and Rabbi Silber was in the bungalow. He used to rest up, he used to go to the country, but he came back to the city from time to time to prepare for the new school year. So he was in the city, and he met with Rabbi Brilovsky in the yeshiva on Church Avenue, and they had a meeting discussing whatever it was for the upcoming year. And then Rabbi Brilovsky mentioned that, it's a lot of the yeshivas, right, 1970, and the world was becoming more big change. Talk about the changing Orthodox world. And the yeshivas starting to adopt the policy of only accepting boys from homes which were Shema Shabbos. And they, said, should we take such a policy or not? Where do we stand on that? Rabbi Silver told him, let's hold off on such a thing. Let's still be open door for everyone. It sounded like he agreed it's going to get there one day, but he didn't. Let's try to hold off as much as possible. And Rabbi Lovsky told him, fine, I understand that, but you realize if other yeshivas only take boys from Shema Shabbos and we take boys even from homes that are not Shema Shabbos, we might lose some of the more from homes that are not going to want to send their children to our yeshiva. And Rabbi Silver told him, you're right, but I know that when I'm going to stand one day before the Bezin Shalmaila, I could say that there are 200 families today that are Shema Shabbos, that I changed from being Mechalel Shabbos to Shema Shabbos, because I took their children into the yeshiva and I changed their families. So that was the end of that conversation. He said, okay, have a great day, and he went off back to the country. And that was the last time that Rabbi Brilovsky spoke to him, because a few days later he had his heart attack and he was nifter. And he went to the Bezin Shemayla. That was the last thing that Rabbi Silver told him. With those, he knows there are at least 200 families that he changed.
Yeah, well, one of the most famous stories was a woman came in to register her son for kindergarten, and only because the family was completely not religious, only because it was convenient, the hours were more convenient. And during the course of conversation, my father realized that she had an older son, and he said, send older son as well. He was in public school. She said, no, he's in public school. So she said, I'll make a deal with you. I'll take them both, but you get two for the price of one. Otherwise, you have to send them both, and I only charge tuition for one of them. So the older boy went, and not only did he go, he made a special class to accommodate that boy, because he wanted to have a boy come from public school. And that older boy today is a very, very prominent, Rosh Yeshiva in Israel, has taught thousands of Talmidim have gone through his yeshiva. So just the idea of the impact.
I was fascinated. I read a story about the Mets in Yeshiva Eastern Parkway, and the Seder plate as opposed to the mezuzah. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So after the fire in 1968, there was a very, very devastating fire. The building was a year old, and there was an arson attack on the Beis Medrash was burnt down. The 7 Sefer Torah, the Tefillah, Svarim. It was a devastating.
Did they ever find who did it?
Attack. Yes, it was actually 2 teenagers who were arrested soon after. Yes, 2 teenagers. And in fact, the first word they said to the judge by the Yeruchim was, because we hate Jews. So
wow.
Anti-Semitism is nothing.
It doesn't change. We see the same thing today, unfortunately.
But at any rate, there was a major fundraising campaign, obviously to replace to rebuild the Beis Medrash. And during the course of the various meetings, one of the people knew someone who was close then with Gil Hodges, who was then the manager of the Mets. And they arranged for the Mets to give, and they had a Jewish player, then Art Shamsky, who was a Jewish player. They arranged for the Mets to give $500. That was, by the way, before players made millions of dollars. They played, so it may not seem like a lot, but those days it was a nice amount of money. In 1969, and they went down. My father and a few of the board members went down to Shea Stadium one night to make the presentation. And when he accepted the check, he gave back as a token of appreciation a Seder plate, which said Manish Tana Halayla Hazeh, and Gil Hodges asked him to translate it. He goes, why would this night be different? And anyway, they had lost a few games in a row that night. They began a winning streak. And won 11 games in a row, and then went on to be called the famous Miracle Mets. Those that remember that ended up winning the World Series. So it all started that night when the team got turned around that night. So any Mets fans listening, you should know, 1969, the Yeshivistan Park was the reason why the Mets won the World Series that year. The reason behind the Miracle Mets. That story's been printed many times. It's been a number of times before the book. It's been in Tala magazine, Mishpacha magazine. It's been it's one of the most famous stories.
So did they ever come back for another?
Yeah, he was told that they should bring, that they're expecting a mezuzah.
Right.
But he didn't want to give him a mezuzah, right?
And he said, no, he's not giving him. He said, mezuzah is going to hang it in, and he didn't think it was appropriate. They told him just give him a mezuzah case, and he told him, no, it's not. They will be honest. He said, no mezuzah. It's a davar shebekdusha, and he can't give him mezuzah, even though they told him it's expected. You got to do it. And he came up with an idea. What's more Jewish than a Seder play, right?
Right. So that went over well. We're looking at the story, Rabbi Meilech. What were you saying, Rabbi Yeruchim? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
In fact, the postscript was a few weeks later. Today you get pictures emailed right away within 2 hours. So those days the pictures were printed. It came up in the mail a few weeks later, and the person whose name is Jerome Belson, who had set it up, said, "Here are your pictures. By the way, Gil Hodge wants to know if you could travel with the team to reproduce the winning streak." So as a traveling chaplain about it, I guess he turned it down. He had more important things to do at the time, running yeshiva. He wasn't,
He should tell me he can. If they give more money, they can control it from Church Ave and 45th. He doesn't have to travel with the team.
Yeah.
We're looking at the book called Blazing the Trail, the story of Rabbi Meilech Silber, the impact of the Yeshivistan Park upon the American Torah world. Our guest, Rabbi Yeruchim Silber. In a different capacity, he is director of New York Government Relations of Good Israel of America, and he lost his father. I believe you were about 14 years old, correct?
Yes.
But he's the impetus behind the book, which took decades in the making. Rabbi Yaakov Rosenberg wrote the book. We come back. We'll be with us for a little while longer.
Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Talkline radio and TV with Zev Brenner is just phenomenal. Everybody concerned about the Jewish community should listen and watch. He has the best guests. He asks the most interesting questions. He's always so well prepared. It's talk radio and television from a Jewish point of view at its very best.
To advertise on the Talkline network and Talkline's email and social media blasts reaching over 70,000 people, please call 212-769-1925, extension 100. That's 212-769-1925, extension 100. Or email info@talklinenetwork.com.
Thank you for listening to today's episode.
You're listening to Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast on the air since 1981.
Here is your host.
We're back. Our final stretch, Rabbi Yeruchim Silber, Rabbi Yaakov Rosenberg. The fascinating book is called Blazing the Trail, the story of Rabbi Meilech Silber and the impact of the Yeshivistan Parkway upon the American Torah world. And I went there for high school, and it was a very interesting experience. I enjoyed the Rabbim, including Rabbi Shlomo Prager, who the book is dedicated to. Okay, let's squeeze in one or two phone calls. Let's go to Yossi in Brooklyn. Go ahead. You have a question or comment to our guest. Go ahead, Yossi.
Good Tavach, Yeruchim. How are you, Yeruchim?
Good Tavach.
So I'm going to remind you of a story. I started to tell Zev. I'm going to remind you of a story. I'm going to go back when you were in the base medrash.
Just lower your radio, Yossi, because we're getting feedback from you. Right, just lower your radio while you're speaking. Go ahead.
My radio was closed.
Okay.
I'll get off the speaker.
Okay.
When you were in Adelphia, you asked Rifki Shane for a stender. And sure enough, which stender did she take? Everybody was watching. She took Rechaim Epstein's stender, and she brought it to you, and you used that stender. And they said that was a similar. Rechaim was going to Eastern Parkway.
Okay.
Remember that story?
No, I don't.
But I'm telling you, it's clear like anything.
Okay.
All right, just want to let you know. Okay.
Okay, thanks, Yossi. Good hearing from you.
Okay, bye-bye.
All right, thank you. At least he took a stand, which is so important. Okay. So there's so many wonderful stories in the book, and I urge people to get it. So what else stands out in your mind? Rabbi Yeruchim, what stands out in your mind?
I mean, just the impact and the amount of and the things that I hear so many years later. I meet people. It's 50 years, and I meet people who have such warm memories from it. You would think after so many years, but people really look back at the Yeshivistan Parkway. That's to me the biggest thing that I've heard, constantly over the years. What kind of good and warm feelings and memories people have of those days, back then.
No, it certainly was, an interesting experience. And listen, a lot of Talmidei Chachamim came out from there, and a lot of, it helped change the course of American Orthodoxy, and which is what the book is all about. Let me turn to you, Rabbi Yaakov Rosenberg. I think Rabbi Yeruchim was a big impetus, right? How many decades did he take to get this book get going?
Well, it just kind of took me recently, 2 years ago. But he was collecting things. I mean, I have documents, papers, things that he put together, and interviews, because, Meilech was lived 50 years ago, and the whole early family history and things like that, there's no one today who could have given all that information. It's just that this was more than the first time that he worked on it. So I had old recordings of interviews. There were interviews that Rabbi Yeruchim himself conducted with some old friends of his father, and then there was a time, over 25 years ago, that they actually had someone else work on the book. Rabbi from Stone worked on putting together a book, and he conducted many interviews, including 8-9 hours of interviews with Meilech's two sisters. He had two older sisters. One is Rabbi Yeruchim Olshin's mother, Mrs. Olshin, Mrs. Pepi Olshin, and Mrs. Esther Adler. So they I just sat. He gave me a whole bag of micro cassettes that I sat and listened to, all these old interviews, all these old, family members and things like that. Otherwise, we never would have gotten the book that we did without that information. So I got all that from Yeruchim that he's been, those recordings are about 30 years old, 25, 30 years old. Other early interviews, so that besides the people that I spoke to now, I had a lot of information from interviews conducted over the years. It was also, and that's just helpful. It was vital to the book.
I see you have also some words from Rabbi Joshua Silber from the Pirchei Agudat Israel of America, too. He was the famous, man behind Pirchei Agudat Israel. Tell about his relationship with Rabbi Meilech Silber.
Well, Josh was one of my father's closest friends. He was our neighbor, Montgomery Street in Crown Heights. We lived in the same apartment building for many, many years. So they worked close together before. My father had been involved in Pirchei Agudat Yisrael before he joined Yeshivistan Parkway. So Josh was really one of his closest friends. So and he at that time the article in the book was from an article that he wrote soon after within the first year of my father passing away. Josh wrote an article in the publication that was called Darkenu. Then it was the magazine of Pirchei Agudat Yisrael. That's where it appeared. So it was reprinted in the book. We had a collection of articles written. That time we felt it would really be interesting to capture the feeling of the time, how people wrote when it was really fresh. And that's those number of articles. The Josh Silber's article among them was put in an appendix that really captured the feeling at that time within the first few months after he passed away. Now, did you get the feeling? I know when I went to Yeshiva Parkway, people kept saying to me, "Oh, you must be Lubavitch because you call it Yeshiva Eastern Parkway." Did you ever consider that when they chose the name? Because I got that. I'm sure you must have gotten, or anybody who went to the yeshiva got that. Are you Lubavitch? Yeah, but realizing that Crown Heights, now it's obviously, almost exclusively Lubavitch, but those days it was not. Lubavitch was there. There was certainly prominent then, but there were many other groups and many other people. So at that time it wasn't thought of as a purely exclusive Lubavitch neighborhood, Crown Heights. So, no, at that time not. Actually, over the years, Eastern Parkway now connotates Lubavitch, but no, at that time it was just the neighborhood of Crown Heights, where there's many people living in Crown Heights. The Baba Rebbe lived in Crown Heights then, and the Boston Rebbe, and many other people. I grew up there.
Certainly. May I recommend the book? The book is called Blazing the Trail, the story of Rabbi Meilech Silber, the impact of Yeshiva.
Published by Feldheim and available at all your fine Judaica bookstores.
And is it on Amazon too?
Yes, it's on Amazon, and it's available also through Feldheim website, through, I guess, Feldheim.com. Amazon and your local Jewish bookstore.
So it's a wonderful book, and it's certainly a tribute to what Yeshiva Eastern Park contributed to the growth of American Orthodoxy. I want to thank you, Rabbi Yeruchim Silber, who is Director of New York Government Relations for Good Israel of America. Thank you, Rabbi Yaakov Rosenberg of Lakewood, New Jersey, and for being with us. And I'll give out the name of the book again. It's called Blazing the Trail, the story of Rabbi Meilech Silber and the impact of the Yeshiva Eastern Parkway upon the American Torah world, from Feldheim Press. And thank you for being with us, and continued success. And will there be a sequel about what happened to the yeshiva after Rabbi Meilech Silber?
Well, there is
an epilogue in the back of the book.
In the back that describes that, yes. Yeah.
Oh, there is. Okay, so there is some part because I remember you had some wonderful Rabbi. When I was there, you had Rabbi Levenberg and had Rabbi Prager, and there was Rabbi Spiegel and Rabbi Shmuel Miller, who passed away pretty recently.
Just recently, yeah.
I interviewed him. He gave me a lot of time.
So some of the Rabbi that I had there. Anyway, gentlemen, thank you so much. Good vach, and look forward to having you back again too.
Thank you. Good vach.
Good vach.
Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Hi, this is David Gabe, and you're listening to the Zev Brenner Show.
Thanks for listening.
For continuous Jewish programs, TalklineNetwork.com, or our 24-hour-a-day listen line at 641-741-0389. For past shows, you can find us on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, YouTube, Instagram, and all major podcast platforms, or jewishpodcast.org. Thanks for listening to the TalklineNetwork.com.
And you're listening to the Talkline Network over WVIP 93.5 FM HD2, New Rochelle, New York. We are America's only Jewish radio.